We have reached the point in the fighting in Ukraine where the just war principles no longer apply to either side. A ceasefire is imperative, and that's the subject of this episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. Welcome to The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Christopher Mayer, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry, retired. With the summary episode on peace, episode 109, I believe that I've said everything that needs to be said to understand war, at least what I think the citizens of a republic should know. This allows me to digress a bit now. What I intend to do from this point on in this podcast series is to look at the current issues regarding war and peace and to let you know what I think about them, but always in the context of the information presented earlier. So, for example, I already addressed peace proposals, but there's always new developments, and I'll address those new developments with reference to what I described earlier about that. Another topic I'll talk more about is private military and security companies and mercenaries. Despite the death of Prigozhin and Utkin, Wagner in some form or another continues to be a tool of Russian policy. Recently, I submitted a paper to the UN Working Group on Mercenaries that reviewed the challenges of these Russian commercial military actors, as well as the way that private military organizations can help end wars and protect or advance human rights. I haven't really talked much about military technological developments, such as drones, whether they're in the air, the ground, or on the water, or artificial intelligence, or the challenges of traditional military forces against increasingly technologically sophisticated insurgent forces. None of these modern developments, however, challenge the fundamental nature of the ancient art of warfare. I'm also going to try not to use a script anymore. Not today, however, I got a script. But we'll see how that works. I may bring on other voices, and although I'll try to keep the episodes short, I may have to go long form as the situation requires. But for the rest of this episode, I'm going to pick up where I left off about ending the war in Ukraine. I'll start, as you might expect, with a quote from Clausewitz, Book 1, Chapter 1. Now, this is where the really good stuff is. If you're ever inclined to pick up a copy of On War, read Book 1, Chapter 1. Read it several times. Then, don't worry about the rest of it. In my opinion, the rest is mostly commentary on that opening. Even Clausewitz, in his notes before he died of cholera, wrote that it was the only part that he thought was really complete. Anyway, the passage for today is, the ultimate outcome of a war is not always to be regarded as final. The defeated state often considers the outcome merely a transitory evil, for which a remedy may still be found in political decisions at a later date. And that's where I think we are. The Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago now, was a crime against humanity. It was absolutely a violation of just war principles, not only justice in going to war, but also justice in continuing the war or how they fight the war. We cannot allow them to retain any benefits that they have gained from waging that unjust aggressive war. This isn't just a matter of a just outcome for Ukraine. A Russian sense of victory over Ukraine will embolden Putin with regard to the rest of the Russian or Soviet Empire. For the past year, however, the war has looked more like World War I-style positional warfare than anything we saw in the late 20th century or even in this current century. Russia appears unable to achieve its strategic objectives as long as the United States and other Western countries continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons and ammunition it needs to hold off any Russian breakthrough. And despite that Western support, Ukraine does not appear to be able to achieve any sort of overmatch that will enable a breakthrough, forcing Russia back to its 2022 starting positions, much less the 2014 internationally agreed borders. For both sides, the costs of fighting the war increase without the likelihood of either side achieving its objectives for the war. This means that we're in the position of violating two of the just war criteria: proportionality and reasonable expectation of success. Now, this applies mostly to Ukraine and the West because, as I mentioned earlier, Russia's been in violation of jus ad bellum and jus in bello since the beginning of the war. Now, Clausewitz cites 3 reasons for pursuing peace. These are inability to carry on the struggle, improbability of victory, and unacceptable cost. Right now, it seems to me anyway, that all 3 conditions seem to exist on both sides. Therefore, it is time for a ceasefire, or what Clausewitz would call a suspension in military action, without, however, abandoning the just cause for which Ukraine is fighting. I need to make it very clear that a ceasefire at this point does not acknowledge the legitimacy of Russian gains or a victory for Russian armed forces. Also, that a ceasefire is not peace. The ceasefire minimally pauses the fighting, and at best, it's a necessary precondition for peace. Now, the most important precondition for peace, or the most precondition for a ceasefire, is that both sides must be willing to stop fighting, as I've said in previous episodes. Right now, both sides seem unwilling to stop fighting. Now, Putin's overtures for peace and a ceasefire I regard as just pure political gamesmanship intended to separate the West from Ukraine. Now, why is it that neither side wants to, or seems that they want to stop fighting? Well, it could be because each side believes that the three conditions for pursuing peace that Clausewitz described don't necessarily apply to them. Now, by the way, I'm not proposing that Zelensky or Putin follow Clausewitz, although he is studied in all Russian military education. It's just that Clausewitz doesn't really come up with any sort of doctrine that you need to follow as much as he's describing the fundamentals of war and peace as it has been practiced over millennia. Now, both sides seem to believe that they can carry on the struggle, or at least Ukraine thinks it can so long as they get support from the West. For his part, Putin believes that he can manipulate the West into halting or at least slowing down that support, and if he can do that, then victory looks very probable for him. Now, unacceptable cost is a matter of perspective, but it is a perspective that gave us Verdun and the Somme in World War I. Also, Putin may come to believe that NATO may come to the conclusion of unacceptable cost before Kiev does. I think that the Trump administration's communications with Putin and the difficulties with Zelensky are efforts to get both sides to recognize the realities that demand a ceasefire. At least I hope that's what he's driving at. Ceasefires are more than just everyone saying that they're going to stop shooting tomorrow. It requires negotiations and agreements. Now, Zelensky pointed out that Russia makes a mockery of diplomacy and doesn't live up to agreements. In that regard, should we trust Russia in these negotiations? Hell no. But right now, we have to get Putin in a position where he's willing to stop fighting. That means we have to be diplomatic in our approach. Now, Will Rogers once said that diplomacy is the art of saying, "nice doggy," until you can find a rock. The U.S. administration can say "nice doggy" to Putin while we hold that rock behind our backs and we remain willing to use it. Putin knows we have that rock, and for the near term anyway, we're willing to use it if we have to. Now, I'm not sure we can trust Ukraine either. Ukraine has been grievously wronged by this war, and passions run high from bottom to top, top to bottom. Personally, I think that the Ukrainian armed forces are just as likely to violate a ceasefire as any Russian armed forces are. So we have to keep them both on track with any ceasefire to let negotiations work, and this is why an international peacekeeping force is important, and not just one that merely observes, but one that can actually take action when they see a violation. Any lasting peace must be more than just the return of territory. War crimes and crimes against humanity and reparations must also be addressed. For Ukraine, it also means the return to democratic principles of governance and to address the corruption that diverted the treasure of other nations and kept the Ukrainian military from optimum efficiency. But barring regime change in Moscow or a complete collapse of Ukrainian national will, no progress on any of these will happen without the necessary precondition of a ceasefire.